What is up, guys? My name is Bosox, and we're back with another video. Today I do want to get into a topic that has been discussed a ton recently, and that is sunsetting, because Bungie recently announced in Season 13 they'll be reissuing all of the Dreaming City gear, as well as all of the Moon gear, including weapons and armor, so that you can use it at our current power levels, meaning you can bring it into Trials of Osiris, Grandmaster Nightfalls, any raids, those types of things. You can use that gear with new perk pools in these activities. And it kind of stirred up a controversy about what actually was sunsetting attempting to do when Bungie initially pitched the idea. And that's kind of where some of my problems with sunsetting lie now that we've seen it in full force. I personally was a fan of the idea of sunsetting. However, with the implementation of it, I have not been happy with the way it is working currently in Destiny 2. And so my first issue with sunsetting is the reissued stuff versus new stuff that we've gotten in Destiny 2. With Beyond Light, we got rid of a ton of gear. We got rid of a ton of weapons. We got rid of essentially 3 years of weapons almost. I think technically like 2 full years and then another season. So that's a lot of guns to get rid of, a lot of armor to get rid of. And then with new stuff coming in, it wasn't equivalent. There's some cool raid weapons like the Heritage shotgun. I think the sniper's actually pretty cool. Personally, I don't use 180 hand cannon, so I didn't like the hand cannon at all this season. The stuff at Varix is very limited, and some of it's decent, but not great. And then I think one of the coolest weapons we've probably got all season is the Deafening Whisper, which is the Void version of Breachlight, which is a grenade launcher that shoots a flame out when it makes contact with the ground, for example, and like can do a bunch of AoE damage to enemies in a straight line, which I think is actually really cool. But it brings me back to this point of their initial response to try and curb some of the sunsetting issues in the next season is not to introduce much new stuff, but bring back a bunch of old stuff that we've already farmed. And people don't like that. People don't like being told, well, your old weapon with this perk pool with these perks is completely useless in activities. You can't bring that into Trials of Osiris. I don't care. It doesn't matter how long you've been practicing with it and playing with it. But in the new season, you can go out and get the exact same gun, and maybe, possibly even in certain circumstances, like in Season of Arrivals, get the exact same perk roll on it. So that's good. It doesn't work for a player. Like, there's no incentive for a player to go out and regrind for that, knowing that a year down the line, that one's going to be completely useless. So I think with sunsetting, what we thought was it was going to be a reintroduction, or it was going to reintroduce a couple things here and there, like fan favorites, and then bring a bunch of new stuff in that was going to be really fun to use. And this kind of bleeds into the next point, which is that Bungie told us one of the reasons they were going to sunset stuff was because of power creep. So back when, like, Recluse and Spare Rations were two of the best guns in the game, the only way Bungie would have been able to stop you from using those guns is either nerf the crap out of the gun so that it's completely useless, or sunset it so that at a certain point it will no longer be very useful to you. And these were their two options, essentially, and they chose the sunsetting version. That's a way for them to kind of mitigate some power creep. But at the same time, they told us that because we can do this now, we can introduce you new powerful things, new powerful weapons, because we know that a year down the line, they'll eventually stop being used by a majority of the player base. Recluse, for example, doesn't get used too much anymore, and it can't be used in certain activities. And so this sounded really interesting to us, because it was a way for Bungie to avoid a creeping of power creep, where they're gonna, every season you have to make something better than the last season. But at the same time, they've kind of dropped they haven't created enough powerful things to interest players. I thought that this was going to be a way for them to possibly bring back things like pinnacle weapons. The 21% Delirium was actually a really cool gun. It had a perk called Killing Tally, where its damage would increase over time, and it would maintain that damage buff until you reloaded the gun. But it also had Overflow, where it would reload itself as well, so you could constantly keep the perk up. And it was a really cool playstyle where you didn't have to reload the gun at all, and over time, after switching to it after swapping to it, you would be able to all of a sudden get a ton of damage out of your machine gun. This was a really cool gun, and it was never really overpowered because it was a machine gun, and so it wasn't really used in PvP. In PvE, it was just overall a really powerful weapon, and I thought that meant they were going to bring back more things like this, really interesting guns that would eventually disappear after a year and be replaced by other interesting guns. And that's actually relatively normal for MMOs and things like that. For loot to, when a new content drop expansion happens, the old stuff you've been playing with isn't really useful in there. You have to go out, you have to get new stuff, you have to power up again. But when you power up, you get a ton of new stuff that makes it so you create new playstyles and interesting ways to play the game, where you kind of almost forget about all the old stuff you used to use. This actually happened in Destiny 2 when the Taken King released. Everyone was really upset. They were saying, my Black Hammer's gone, my Fatebringer's gone. And after a while, that commentary eventually just disappeared when people got the new raid weapons from the Taken King, or they got the new machine gun, or they got a bunch of other cool weapons from vendors and faction vendors and things like that. And so that works in Destiny 2. Bungie's proven it works in Destiny 2. But with the current design of sunsetting, every 3 months Bungie has to produce something that's new and interesting for that kind of to keep up and keep going, because you're going to get rid of stuff that's interesting from past seasons. And this kind of brings me to the final point, is there's no incentive to get this relatively mediocre stuff for players when it's going to disappear in a year. For example, next season, the Season of Dawn loot is going to expire. You're not going to be able to use it in high-end activities. You're not going to be able to use it in endgame PvE, endgame PvP activities. And that's a real downer, because some of that stuff is actually really cool. Breachlight's one of my favorite sidearms in the game, and so the fact that they're getting rid of this stuff is really sad. And as a player, it's kind of like, okay, you got rid of a bunch of my stuff. If I just grind for this new stuff, then in a year it's just going to be gone, and it creates this incentive for players to not play the game and not farm these cool weapons and things like that. The only reason people, for example, are farming a ton of Hawkmoons right now is because it's an exotic, so it won't go away. And so those are kind of my thoughts on sunsetting. I think it was a great idea and great concept, and it's just been implemented poorly up until this point. So I hope Bungie takes the community feedback that they've been getting from a ton of players now, and they can rework it and redesign it so that players will be happy and excited to earn new stuff and not be so bummed out when it eventually disappears, to the point where their incentive and their drive to play the game all of a sudden goes away because they know stuff is going to slowly disappear.